Hello. Hello. Hi, Kay. Hi, Avril. Thank you. And Dolores says hi, all. And Dolores says sharing. Steve Wolfbrand says good evening, all. Kay says hi, Steve. Please share, everyone. Okay, COVID-19 upsurge. I'm going to start with a piece from Counterpunch. It expressed some of my frustrations. Title of it is COVID Ignoramuses. I picked it out because it's one of the only things I've seen other than my own stuff here that really provides a comparative perspective. It was done on November 13th by Eve Ottenberg, and it's called COVID Ignoramuses. As I mentioned, you are seeing it also. And there's a picture of some of the ignoramuses. Lying media, I do not consent, and the lockdown. This is about tyranny versus freedom. Freedom, of course, to these people is don't tell me what to do. I don't care how much sense it makes. I don't care what it is. Don't tell me what to do. On the other hand, they're for the government keeping order, aren't they? It's there for the government coming in to certain cities with troops and putting people down who are protesting. To these people, that's not an issue of tyranny versus freedom. It's an issue of law and order versus chaos, right? They probably think taxes is an issue of tyranny versus freedom also. Anyway, on election night, one exit poll revealed that 48% of respondents believed the government had done a good job, including coping with COVID-19. In other words, 48% of respondents are imbeciles who approved of what happened that day. Specifically, 1,100 coronavirus deaths and 94,000 new cases. Only 4 in 10 voters ranked the pandemic as their top concern. If the election disclosed one thing, it's that about half of all Americans have their heads in the sand regarding the pandemic and are likely blithely, provincially unaware that no other country on earth has failed as miserably as the U.S. to contain the disease. Okay, well, you know what I think about that. I think you know what I think about that, but I'm going to go over it anyway because we're not the absolute worst country in the world. The worst country in the world in terms of containing the spread is currently Belgium. They have 1,259 deaths per million. They've now even surpassed the little country of San Marino, with only 38,000 people in it. I'm sorry, San Marino has about 34,000 people in it, and they have 1,237 deaths per million. So Belgium is now number one in the world, not even discounting San Marino. But normally, as you know, I discount of the minuscule nations. And then there's Peru. They're number 2, discounting San Marino. And they're at 1,066 deaths per million. And then Spain is number 3 at 891. All of these nations have many more deaths per million than does the United States. That said, starting with Argentina, which, discounting the minuscule nations, is number 4 in the world. Argentina's at 796. Ecuador is at 734 fatalities per million. Starting with Ecuador, there are a number of nations, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 nations, including Ecuador, have scores of 734 deaths per million to 796 deaths per million for Argentina. So 9 nations are in that particular group within 62 spaces of one another. So Bolivia's at 755, Mexico 764, the United States 766, 32 ahead of Ecuador, only 30 behind the lead nation in this group, which is Argentina. Notice how many Latin American nations are in this group. 2, 3, 6 of the 9 are Latin American nations. And Latin America is being hit hard by the virus. Argentina, which not too long ago was way down there, is, as I said, the first nation in this group at 796. We at 766 are 9th in the world, discounting the minuscule nations. So to go back to the article, there are 8 other nations, discounting the minuscule nation, that have failed as miserably or more miserably than the United States. That's using the measure of fatalities per million. We could use the measure of cases per million, okay, if you'd rather use that. If you're looking at cases per million, then things look a little different. Then the number 1 nation, okay, is actually Bahrain. They're not a minuscule country. There are 1.7 million people there. but still the United States is very high in total cases per million, if that is what you're looking at. Actually, Czechia is very high in cases per million, 43,687. But in cases per million, the United States is, taking the minuscule nations out of here, we have you could probably take 7 nations out of there if you were using cases per million as the measure. That's a better measure than spread. So we'd probably be looking at number 8 in the world in cases per million, okay, if you want to use that. Okay, so either way, we're not exactly the worst. So you might not consider that exaggeration as really a big issue, but I like to be as accurate as I can, okay, in what I say. So there are other countries on earth that have failed as miserably or more miserably than the United States. But we are in the top 10 of miserable, top 10 of miserable. It's also a good bet that most of those Trump voters would simply guffaw in belligerent disbelief at the news that countries like left-governed New Zealand, semi-socialist Vietnam, vaguely communist China, and other non-white countries like South Korea and Taiwan eradicated this plague, that people in those lands get to lead normal lives. Their children go to school. They go to work. They frequent bars and restaurants. Their hospitals are not swamped by critically ill patients, nor do they run the risk of contracting a potentially lethal, chronic, and disabling disease every time they visit the supermarket. How to account for such American ignorance, stupidity, and insularity? Back in the 20th century, H.L. Mencken, a notorious misanthrope, by the way, dubbed the U.S. a boobocracy. He was right then, and his verdict holds up today. American morons are everywhere. Their views on COVID prove it. On November 4th, while all eyes were riveted on election results, this plague killed over 1,600 Americans. And there were over 100,000 new cases. 2 days later, there were 121,000 new cases. Later, over 135,000 new cases in one day. By the way, how many new cases were there yesterday in the United States? Or I should say today in the United States. 144,795. That was a little less than yesterday, by the way, when there were 162,000 cases. So we did get a decline. $149,795. It's a decline compared to yesterday. Still plenty bad, though, isn't it? Still plenty bad. And new infections and deaths zoomed up and up at that pace or faster thereafter, going back to the peace. At this rate, according to one medical expert, we could have 1 million dead by late February. I don't think we'll have that. For that, because of, I think we're going to start doing some things. I think we're already starting. For that, you can thank Trump's mass murdering policy of herd immunity and the 1/3 of voters who told pollsters that they believe the economy's urgency drugged the pandemics. Roughly 50% of Americans wear masks. That's not enough to stop the virus, but those unmasked multitudes don't care, so long as their God-given right to infect others is not infringed. That's what we're talking about here. They're claiming they have a God-given right to infect others, to infect you and me, even if we don't want to be infected. Even some of you and me are claiming that they have a God-given right to infect others. Incredible. It's a violation of their natural rights to mandate that they wear masks. With over 10 million U.S. COVID cases, this pestilence has now killed over 240,000 Americans. Actually, that's way behind. It's approaching 255,000 dead, according to Worldometer. Today it was 254,125 is their figure. Some sites are a little lower, but 240,000 is definitely an underestimate. Definitely. But what Eve Ottenberg says, is that a month ago, experts cited excess death statistics to prove the true number was then over 300,000. So by now, it's more. Yeah. By now, it's about 350,000. Whichever it is, it's too many. It far exceeds the COVID death rate of any other country. You've already seen that's not true. It's much worse in Belgium. Whichever it is, it's too many. Indeed, the world gapes in horror as the U.S. fumbles the pandemic, just as it watched in dismay as the U.S. fumbled Hurricane Katrina. In fact, COVID is Trump's Katrina, not just because it cost him votes, but because apparently, like Bush with the hurricane, Trump was far too incompetent to do anything about the catastrophe other than make it worse. Bush's ineptness led a great American city drown. Trump's ignorance and abysmal instincts have cost the U.S. even more. 10 months into it, the debacle just roars on. Why? Well, this is in the country where in August, as COVID percolated poisonously through the Midwest, 250,000 bikers, one for every death, right, converged on Sturgis, South Dakota, for a summer shindig. They didn't wear masks, and they didn't socially distance, and lots of them got sick. Now they have angry, acrid regrets. According to the New York Times, quote, Sturgis council members who approved the rally have been bombarded with death threats. The event caused roughly 250,000 coronavirus infections nationwide. All of this was completely predictable. The bikers who went to Sturgis behaved like irresponsible children. Some of them paid the price. But so did plenty of other people who had nothing to do with that. The bikers' fecklessness mirrored Trump's. After he hosted a super spreader soiree for his radical right-wing Supreme Court nominee, numerous guests contracted COVID, including Trump and Chris Christie. They knew they could get sick, but they couldn't resist the fantasy that things would, quote, go back to normal, unquote. How stupid is that? This virus has made blindingly clear its power to relegate normal to paradise lost. As any adult knows, normal is over for the foreseeable future until we get a good, tested, reliable vaccine. The Trump regime's infantile, quote, I want, give me parties, give me cameras, give me glitzy, crowded blowouts, unquote, had a perfectly foreseeable outcome. It's a miracle. None of those overgrown toddlers were intubated and died. Or maybe some were. If so, you can be sure we won't hear about it. So now, what can Biden do? He can negotiate with the lame Trump regime for a national mask mandate tout suite. He has also named his coronavirus task force. Otherwise, he probably must wait until January. Well, not so. He can jawbone. He can jawbone all over the country. He can go on a speaking tour all over the country, urging people to wear masks. He's the president-elect. He can start acting like a leader right now. His moves then will hopefully include finally revving up the National Defense Authorization Act to its fullest potential to produce protective gear for medical workers, most of them reusing masks in the COVID-crammed hospitals of Trump country. He should assure that vaccine distribution plans are ready and not enfeebled by the malicious neglect that plagued testing. He should fix testing and contact tracing once and for all. Regarding economic impacts, Trump should back up those states and localities that have to impose targeted lockdowns, as Utah just did, by releasing funds to support workers and small business people thus idled, by executive order if necessary. He must try to pass another stimulus with unemployment dollars, basic income, money for cities and states, and a full-fledged rent and mortgage moratorium, and even rent forgiveness, and to atone for his wretched 1994 crime bill, which he now acknowledges was a mistake. Biden should do everything possible to release nonviolent and elderly felons from those disease-infested pits, the prisons. These are only some of the weapons in a president's arsenal against this plague. It is high time, past time, they were deployed. Man or lady, and Lady Eve Ottenberg, you can say all that again. And on we go. Here's a piece from Truthout. Some GOP governors and senators are simply dismissing the new COVID surge. Aren't you glad they're simply dismissing it? There's Kristi Noem. Kristi Noem. She speaks as President Trump listens during a meeting in the cabinet room of the White House on December 16th, 2019 in Washington, D.C. Last summer, this is by Heather Digby Parton, otherwise known as Digby, the blogger Digby from Ceylon. Last summer, Kristi Noem of South Dakota welcomed bikers from across the country to the annual rally in the town of Sturgis. Hundreds of thousands showed up and they partied like there was no tomorrow. And for some of them, there was no tomorrow. But Noem, a rising Republican star, didn't cancel the state fair and refused to issue much guidance on how to avoid spreading COVID-19. As the state's caseload rose quickly throughout the fall, she spent $5 million of federal COVID relief money creating ads to encourage tourism to come to the state. She's rejected all advice from the CDC and has made it clear she will defy any mandates coming from a new administration as well. I don't know about you, I think she ought to be jailed. She says she leaves it up to her people to do what's best for their families because she values freedom. Apparently, she believes these people should have the freedom to infect innocent bystanders as well. And when I was a kid, I always learned that my freedom ends where your nose begins. That's why you can't punch somebody in the nose. Anyway, she believes these people should have the freedom to infect innocent bystanders as well. Tomorrow has arrived. The state is now considered to be one of the worst COVID hotspots in the world, and hospitals are in a desperate situation. Over the weekend, the South Dakota nurse wrote this disturbing dispatch on Twitter. I have a night off from the hospital. As I mind my couch with my dog, I can't help but think of the COVID patients of the last few days. The ones that stick out are those who still don't believe the virus is real. The ones who scream at you for a magic medicine and that Joe Biden is going to ruin the USA, all while gasping for breath on 100% Vapotherm. I don't know what Vapotherm is exactly, folks. I guess I got to Google that. They tell you there must be another reason they are sick. They call you names and ask why you have to wear all that, quote, stuff, unquote. Because they don't have COVID, because it's not real. Yes, this really happens, she says. I'm sure it does, says Digby. Here are some Americans who simply refuse to take the threat seriously, even when a family member has succumbed to the virus. And Aaron Rupar tweets, can the masks really defend a microbe coming through the weaving of the fiber? I kind of doubt it. For heaven's sakes, why would ABC give airtime to this painfully misguided view? We already understand there are lots of ignorant Trump supporters out there. Of course, at ABC, their clicks are more important than your rights not to get infected. So that's why they'll show that. Noem is already being mentioned as a possible presidential candidate in 2024 or beyond, which makes sense. I'm sorry, not to me. Not to me. It makes utterly no sense at all. Not only should she be a presidential candidate, she should be run out of the country on a rail. She is one of Donald Trump's natural heirs, even using his patented lies and happy talk approach to the virus, telling lawmakers recently that, quote, in South Dakota, we didn't take a one-size-fits-all approach, and the results have been incredible, unquote. Incredible, yes. Incredibly horrific, says Digby. What she's done to her state, Trump and the Republican Party are doing to the entire country. The winter surge that all the scientists predicted is upon us. I think I told you it was starting back in September, isn't that so? I looked at the reproduction rate and I said, uh-oh, it's already starting. That was 2 months ago. Took a while to get here in full force, but it was clear that throughout September and October, more and more states were getting reproduction rates above 1.00. That is the predictor. Excuse me. The winter surge that all the scientists predicted is upon us, and it's very bad. The president and his administration are obsessively trying to convince their voters that the election was stolen from them, which is a lie. So they aren't even pretending to be interested in the rapidly spreading pandemic. Republican officials are missing in action on everything, with senators even refusing to appear on the Sunday morning shows in case they might be asked to explain why their president and their party are tilting at electoral windmills while refrigerator trucks are being commandeered in some states because the morgues are all full. Well, there are some who are happy to continue to spread reckless disinformation. For example, Rand Paul, this is a tweet by Asin Batorabi. Rand Paul, quote, we have 11 million people in our country who have already had COVID. We should tell them to celebrate. We should tell them to throw away their masks, go to restaurants, and live again, because these people are now immune. And Asin says, in parens, they are not immune. At least we and they don't know that they are immune. The Washington Post reported that despite official protestations to the contrary, quote, many administration officials paint a portrait of chaos with senior advisors enabling some of Trump's most questionable instincts on the pandemic, unquote. As an example, they point to White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows' apparent belief that, quote, one of the main ways the virus is spread is through waiters touching the cups of different people at restaurants. As I have pointed out earlier, Mark Meadows is not the sharpest tool in the shed. And they're doing this as the White House itself may be the most famous hotspot in the world, having been the site of 2 super spreader events that sickened numerous members of the staff, Republican officials, Trump family members, and even the president himself. More than 130 Secret Service members are reportedly in quarantine due to Trump's reckless campaign travel. And according to the Post, the health agencies have not been allowed to cooperate with the Biden transition team amid a worsening public health crisis. They no longer even ask for health expert advice before they plan events anymore. Much of this is reportedly attributable to Jared Kushner, who was responsible for persuading Trump not to bother pretending to care about the virus anymore, and who brought on the most pernicious, quote, advisor, unquote, of all, Dr. Scott Atlas, a radiologist from the conservative Hoover Institute and a regular on Fox News. There is no one more responsible for spreading a crude herd immunity theory without understanding that it can only happen without a mass loss of life when combined with the vaccine and mitigation strategies over time. Atlas is still at it. After Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer announced some new restrictions to try to contain the rapid spread of the virus in her state on Sunday night, he tweeted, quote, "The only way this stops is if people rise up. You get what you accept. Hashtag freedom matters. Hashtag step up," unquote. He was highly indignant when it was suggested he should not incite violence in a state where there were armed members of the militias who were recently accepted for plotting to kidnap and execute the governor over COVID restrictions. Numbers are climbing exponentially. The U.S. has reported 11 million total COVID cases as of Sunday, and it was 10 million just a week ago. 1 in 400 people have tested positive since then. With the lax attitude found among roughly half the population, hospitalization and death rates are going to start climbing quickly as well. Ed Young of The Atlantic tweeted, "Here's the thing I want everyone to understand. There's roughly a 12-day lag between rising cases and rising hospitalizations. So the 1.5 million confirmed cases from the last 2 weeks have not yet factored into stories about packed emergency rooms. In this story, I noted Iowa is already out of staffed beds. ICUs are at capacity. Here are Iowa's cases. The 12-day lag between cases and hospitalizations means people in the blue portion will be trying to enter those full ICUs over the next 2 weeks. How?" he asks, and the how is in caps. No beds for the weary, Ed Young says. "I say Iowa, but you could do the same analysis for any number of states, especially in the Midwest. Thank you, Kristi Noem. The near-term future is already baked in, which is why you have to act ahead of the virus." See problem number 8 in this story about 9 intuitive fallacies. And the story is America's Trapped in a Pandemic Spiral, and there's a link to it there. Ed Young says another way to think about these lags is that some of the people who are infected on Thanksgiving Day will enter the hospital in the middle of December and the morgue around Christmas. He continued with a reminder not to forget about the long haulers. There are a lot of the 1.5 million Americans who were infected this month, many young and previously healthy, will still be sick well into 2021. In North Dakota, officials are allowing COVID-positive healthcare workers to continue working. They have no choice. There is a shortage. And unlike in the spring when healthcare workers came from all over the country to help out in the Northeast, the whole country is affected this time and they can't be spared. In fact, while federal and state governments have been playing games and we've all been distracted by the Trump show, those frontline workers have been going to work every single day, month after month, dealing with this deadly disease. The burnout rate is growing rapidly as well. As Young writes in this article, the most precious resource the U.S. healthcare system has in the struggle against COVID-19 isn't some miracle drug. It's the expertise of its healthcare workers, and they are exhausted, unquote. There is no help on the way. The federal government is paralyzed because the president is even less competent than he was before he lost the election. And most Republican governors have more or less washed their hands of the problem. Everyone else is struggling along on their own. We are in for a rough few months. That is the way it looks, folks. Looks like we are in for a rough few months. Indeed. So next, so we have another excellent piece on reactions, on responses. This one from Dave Dayan, today, unsanitized. Republicans boldly decide to stop letting people die. There's Iowa's Governor, Kim Reynolds. Kim Reynolds looking sad. Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds had been resisting any coronavirus restrictions, but she relented on Monday, November 16th. One of the reasons why I know nothing and you should close this newsletter is that I was convinced that the election would turn out badly for the Republicans because of their coronavirus performance. At the least, I figured late deciders would move to the Democrats, given the generally crappy nature of 2020 weighing on their decision. It appears now that the late vote moved to Trump, and the Republicans paid no price for backing him. In fact, in areas with the biggest COVID spikes, Republicans made gains. The GOP is proud of this performance, at least on political terms. It appears to have come down to the residual CARES Act help, covering just long enough to make the people feel okay about their economic position, emphasizing personal responsibility to nationalize normal public health measures like mask mandates, and smearing Democrats as poised to lock down the economy and ruin people's lives. The key to the final point is delaying the passage of any measure that would give people economic security. Warning about lockdowns doesn't make any sense if people are covered with financial support. So much for Nancy Pelosi being the barrier to a stimulus deal. She wasn't the barrier from the beginning. It was the Republicans and Mitch McConnell. From May 23rd onward, he was the barrier. They went on vacation for much of the summer. How many vacation days did they have this summer when they went home and did nothing about giving people economic security? And people didn't punish them for that. Didn't punish them for that. Didn't understand. It was the unwillingness of the Republicans to spend more money on people who needed it. Their usual posture, which now has created the economic crisis, which they were blaming the Democrats for. Dave says, I don't know if this swung undecided voters in the middle, but it certainly played on ancient and narrow conservative notions of freedom, quote unquote, and turned out the base. But it concerned the hell out of me. If Republicans took validation in their laissez-faire approach, then when the virus got really out of control, like right now, they wouldn't do anything about it, and an untold number of people would die for their political strategy. That's certainly how the Trump administration is proceeding, though it's probably not because of ideology and more distractiveness, sloth, and incompetence. And I might add, sheer misanthropy. That's the problem with the Republicans. They hate people. But my fear is that Republicans all over the country would get the go-ahead to abandon their populations in an hour of need have subsided. With that, Republicans are showing the true cynicism of their political strategy, as they're implementing precisely what they savaged the Democrats for preparing to do. Predictably, the new wave of restrictions started on the Democratic side. Chicago issued a stay-at-home advisory last week, encouraging the cancellation of Thanksgiving plans. Oregon and Mexico ordered 2-week lockdowns. There's a travel advisory across the West Coast. Now, I have to say that Bonnie and I took care of our Thanksgiving plans. A quiet dinner here together with each other. We have done most of our shopping already during our regular trips to the grocery store. We wouldn't dare get in a group for Thanksgiving. We don't have COVID, but we intend to live through this pandemic. We haven't gotten enough of life yet. We're fighting for more. Anyway, Oregon and New Mexico ordered 2-week lockdowns. There's a travel advisory across the West Coast. New York, New Jersey, and Virginia put in business restrictions and curfews. Thank you, Governor Northam, a sensible person in this state. The Michigan Governor, Gretchen Whitmer, imposed a partial lockdown and endured crackpot Trump advisor Scott Atlas telling residents to, quote, rise up, unquote, against her, even as the memory of a foiled kidnapping plot still lingered. But Maryland's Republican governor also reduced indoor dining capacity. Granted, he's an East Coast moderate. Yeah, and he's a pretty good guy, too. He seems to care about his people. That was true even from the beginning in Maryland. But in the states where the virus is truly raging, Republican leaders have some notion of protecting the public. Truly amazing, right? Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds, who had been resisting really any public health measures throughout the crisis, on Monday instituted a mask mandate, which is now in effect in 37 states, including conservative ones like Utah, Arkansas, Alabama. Alabama has a mask mandate. What happened to freedom, folks? What happened to freedom? West Virginia and North Dakota. And Douglas Burgum, the governor of North Dakota, Doug Burgum, said in an announcement of a mask mandate limits on gatherings, quote, our situation has changed, and we must change with it. It's sad that it took the virus being literally everywhere to get through to some Republicans. The harms from their politically expedient attitude are already baked in. There's a very real sense that it's too late for many, and even at this late date, some are resisting doing anything to protect people. South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, who appears to think she's going to run for president, has vowed to resist any enforcement of mask mandates or other restrictions from a Biden administration. There's a sense that South Dakota will soon consist of 3 people shouting amid a sea of bodies, quote, at least I know I'm free, unquote. Let's not let Democrats completely off the hook. California Governor Gavin Newsom just announced a bunch of new restrictions, but only after taking heat for personally attending a dinner with his wife for a lobbyist friend at the ritzy French Laundry. I take it the French Laundry is not a laundry. I'm not a Californian, so I don't know, but I take it must be a restaurant or a hotel or something. State lawmakers are at a retreat in Maui with other lobbyists. It would be hard to more deeply undermine moral authority than the Golden State's political class. Let's throw in Nancy Pelosi scheduling a gala dinner in the Capitol for freshman House members. It was eventually canceled. There's a lot of lack of leadership to go around, in other words, and part of it is the human condition of wanting contact and companionship. The positive news on vaccines should offer hope that there's an end date for all of this if we just stick it out a little longer. But that's not quite how the human mind operates. While it's good that America is taking the common path of exhausting all other possibilities before doing the right thing, it comes only after the virus has managed to burrow into every nook of the country. Hey, Dave, what happened to the crannies? I'm satisfied that we've turned the corner. But the corner has been upon us for weeks, he says. And that's it about COVID for tonight. I think you'll have to admit those were three great pieces. Three great pieces. So let's check on what else we got here. Oh, I know the one that's missing. So let's get to coup action, or coup possibilities anyway. I guess we do have, what we have right now is we have what may be a rolling coup action, but we cannot be sure yet. It could be any one of a number of things, because you can go down a specific path, and that path can lead to other paths, and you might not have a definite intention when you start out. You may be just trying to screw around and see what opportunities are presented. But let's go to The Intercept and Naomi Klein in an article called "Now We Have to Fight Trump's Tin Pot Coup and Biden's Worst Instincts." Yes, Biden's worst instincts. So is it a grift to raise cash for Donald Trump, a ploy to goose aggrieved Republican turnout in Georgia's high-stakes Senate runoffs, an elaborate scheme to flatter a nuclear-armed narcissist into gradually accepting the reality that he is what he fears most, a loser, an attempt to preemptively drain the Biden-Harris administration of perceived legitimacy in an effort to clip its wings and then use its ineffectiveness to secure big Republican wins in the midterms. An actual thought-through, coordinated plot for Republican-controlled state legislatures to use the pretext of public concerns over voter fraud, concerns methodically manufactured out of thin air through sheer force of repetition by Trump and his minions to claim a constitutional duty to override their state's certified election results and instead directly appoint Republican presidential electors. In short, is what we are witnessing the prelude to an electoral college coup? As David Sirota first reported, a harrowing paper by Ohio State constitutional law expert Edward Foley warned about this precise scenario last year, explaining how state legislatures could attempt to claim this kind of constitutional cover in order to override certified election results. My take, A through D are definitely happening. A through D again. A grift, a ploy to goose turnout, an elaborate scheme to flatter a nuclear-armed narcissist into gradually accepting the reality that he is what he most fears, a loser. D, an attempt to preemptively drain the Biden-Harris administration of any legitimacy. Or E, the plot to commit a coup d'etat. While the risk of E being a threat is very slim, but slim isn't nil, and given the stakes, that makes it enough to deserve some attention. This has nothing to do with the laughable idea that the Republican lawmakers have too much respect for core democratic principles to engage in such a brazen power grab. These people who owe their holds on state power and in many cases their entire careers to openly anti-democratic redistricting schemes and other wily tools of suppressing at all costs the terrifying prospect of majority rule. They keep finding new ways to tell us that they don't actually believe in representative democracy, and we ought to believe them. Moreover, the tactic of taking minor voting irregularities and outlandishly inflating them to the level of election stealing, thereby justifying a very real coup d'etat, has been the go-to tactic in countless U.S.-backed regime change operations around the world. Schemes supported, it must be said, by Republicans and Democrats alike. Do not tell yourself they are above bringing the tactic home. If the Republican Party refrains, and I believe it will, it won't be out of fealty to democracy, but rather out of loyalty to market and empire. If multiple state governments were to openly override the express will of their electorates, the result would be massive protest and unrest, as well it should be. In the face of this kind of uncertainty in the world's largest economy, markets would crash and U.S. global power would further erode. That's why Rupert Murdoch and other corporate titans are rumored to be trying to talk Trump off the cliff. And I guess I have to remark there, about that. It's not just widespread street protests that they have to fear. There have been many protests thus far. They can put down protests. What they cannot put down is general strikes, huge protests in every city, continuing protests, day after day after day, day after day after day, until democracy is restored. And what they do have to fear is not only that, but what happens after that for those among them who are implicated in a coup. A coup, that would be treason. It might not be legally treason because they could claim some fig leaf of constitutional justification. But if the people in the streets, for the length of time it will take to get them to give up, and to get out, and also the number of people who probably would be killed or severely injured during such an effort, after feelings and attitudes have been inflamed by that kind of event, who knows what kind of retribution the people would take against the participants in such an effort to overthrow the democracy that most people think still exists in the United States. Now, you and I might perceive that this hasn't been a democracy for a long time. But of course, these same elites have been lying to the people all this time. And they still think they live in a democracy. They still think their voice counts. They still think that the results of an election, which appear to have been carried out in an orderly way, should not be overturned by a small elite in state legislatures who were not a part of the national voting effort, not a part of the national campaign effort, a foreign body on national democracy. If people look at it in that way, which the people in the streets would do, the result would not just be massive protest and unrest. It would be more than that. It would be far more serious. And in the event of the final result, I don't think there would be a reconciliation process. Not after the violence that is sure to be unleashed against people expressing their rights to free press, free speech, and free assembly in that particular situation. Still, given the kind of profitable chaos Republicans and their donors have grown accustomed to under Trump, nothing can be ruled out. And as David Sirota reported, these are not abstract fears. Most ominously of all, Republican lawmakers in Pennsylvania, Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Arizona are already insinuating that the results may be fraudulent, even though they haven't produced any evidence of widespread fraud, unquote. Given this reality, Joe Biden's come on man approach of brushing off Republican election denialism as an embarrassment rather than a serious threat is probably a poor one. The Republican strategy, if they do go down this road, relies on state legislatures appealing to a perception, not a reality, that the public has lost faith in the election results. That's a lot easier to claim if the only people screaming outside your offices and bombarding you with phone calls and emails are Trump supporters shouting conspiracy theories about voter fraud, while the people who see a challenge to certified results as a straight-up coup have already moved on, convinced that Republicans won't dare cross yet another Democratic red line, so they aren't even bothering to make the point. To be absolutely clear, the point should have to be made. There is zero evidence of widespread fraud, and ratifying certified results should be a formality. But there is one core lesson to take from the Republican victory in Florida in 2000, when the Bush campaign staged AstroTurf riots and the Gore campaign told supporters to stay home and trust the process. It is that partisan decision makers are swayed by street-level messaging wars. If Republican state lawmakers are inclined toward flagrantly overriding the will of the people, the ability to claim that the overwhelming majority of the people they are hearing from have lost faith in the elections may be excuse enough. Remember, they would not be looking for the truth, which they obviously already know, but rather a marginally plausible cover story. One-sided protests should provide that. It is in this context Democrats should be out there forcefully defending the integrity of the votes and condemning coup plotting for what it is. That means not waving it away as embarrassing, but as Senator Bernie Sanders had done, denouncing it as, quote, an outrage, unquote, that is, quote, delegitimizing our electoral process in American democracy, unquote. The public should not wait for Democratic leaders to tell them it's time to fight back. Anyone who still kind of likes the idea of votes counting for something, regardless of who they voted for, even if they voted this election, should consider taking some time to make their voices heard to legislators in those Republican-controlled houses. This is an organizing challenge, and for understandable reasons. Many of the progressive organizations that ran massive voter education mobilization campaigns during the election have closely studied the lessons of Bush v. Gore, were preparing to stay mobilized to defend the vote if it ended up being close enough to steal. In truth, the election is much closer than it should have been given Trump's murderous reign. But it's hardly a nail-biter, coming down to a few hanging chads. For this reason, most organizers have concluded that this time around, quote, they don't need to focus their energies on avoiding a repeat of the Bush v. Gore-style Democratic Party dumpster fire. Instead, most progressive organizations are working hard to avoid a repeat of a different kind of Democratic Party debacle, the one that unfolded in 2008-2009, in the months between Obama's euphoric election win in November and his inauguration in January. That's when he surrounded himself with a team of hardcore neoliberal economists and Wall Street bankers. And so, despite campaign promises to rebuild Main Street, address structural market failures, and arrest the climate crisis, they spent the transition mapping out a maddeningly inadequate response to the raging financial crisis, one that grossly failed working people and the planet. And that is going on right now. In Biden, we've seen in Biden's announcements about staff that he is appointing right now, we are seeing a band of neoliberals in his White House staff that he's surrounding himself. Not one on that staff thus far is likely to warn him against repeating the mistakes made by Obama in the fall of 2008 and the early days of 2009 before he took office, which then led to the mistakes of that first term in the next few months, which destroyed his chances of retaining control of the Congress in the election of 2010. As the new cabinet was being assembled and its agenda set in stone, anyone who raised concerns about where this train was obviously headed was promptly told to pipe down and, quote, give the guy a chance, unquote. The mantra of those fateful months that were wasted with fantastical narratives about the president's imagined long game. Yeah, I remember stories about he's playing 3-dimensional chess. 13-dimensional chess. Wasn't that it? 13-dimensional chess. You can't know what he has in mind. He's so brilliant, and you're so stupid. Stories that cast Obama as a progressive hero who was only temporarily appeasing the hungry gods of the market in order to buy time for his transformational popular agenda that was always just around the corner. It never came. The political window and Federal Reserve faucet opened up by Wall Street's collapse eventually closed, and the logic of austerity soon bore down once again. The racial wealth gap Biden, the planet burned. The architects of these crimes face no consequences, not until a new wave of far more independent and confrontational movements rose up in Obama's second term. Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, the Dreamers, fossil fuel divestment, no case Keystone XL standing rock. Did we start to see some actual progress? But nothing that administration did match the scale of the crises it faced and which have only deepened since. I'll skip over a bit of that. And she goes on to say, most ambitious has been a campaign just launched by the Sunrise Movement and Justice Democrats, which focuses not only on what the new administration can do, but also who should be appointed to do it. Quoting the president's-elect accurate assertion that voters had given us a mandate for action on COVID-19, the economy, on climate change, on systemic racism, unquote. The groups laid out their own vision of what it would mean for Biden to actually lift up to this high-stakes mandate and solve these overlapping crises. It begins, they argue, with creating a new White House Office of Climate climate mobilization, unquote, modeled after the society-wide mobilizations of World War II. The person leading this office would have broad powers to put the entire administration on emergency footing and coordinate action across the different agencies that every part of the government, from housing to healthcare, was advancing rapid, justice-based decarbonization. Rather than treating climate action as the narrow purview of the EPA and the Department of Energy, quote, the office of that office will deeply embed this mission into all of our spending, regulations, policies, and actions, unquote. By the way, we haven't seen any move from Biden yet to move towards that kind of vision. No hints coming out of the administration's transition team that they're planning anything like this. Seeking to avoid Obama-era setbacks, they also call, Sunrise does, for the cabinet to be made up of a diverse bunch of fighters with no ties to fossil fuel companies or corporate lobbyists. They even released their picks for a dream Biden cabinet, complete with a slick video imagining their favorite candidates being sworn in. The full list is here, and there's a link to it, and I've covered it in short takes, and I'm continuing to cover it in short takes. The full list is here, but highlights includes Sanders for Labor Secretary, Senator Warren for Treasury Secretary, Barbara Lee as Secretary of State, Deb Haaland for Interior Secretary, but for Attorney General, Keith Ellison, who's now Attorney General of Minnesota, for Justice, and Rashida Tlaib for Housing and Urban Development, Jayapal for Health and Human Services, and economist Joseph Stiglitz for Director of the National Economic Council. And there are more in there, too. I'm not going to talk about, the particular people. I've covered that in other streams, and in short takes. I'll be doing some more of that. I think that the Sunrise Movement could have done a better job, particularly because it's unrealistic to think that too many Congress members will be appointed to the administration, considering the thin margins which the Democrats have in the House, at this point. It's looking like they might come out with 223 to 225 seats in the Congress, to 210 for the Republicans. Those margins are thin enough that we can't have vacant appointments that might be filled by Republican governors. Also, when we get to Rashida and to Deb Haaland, and to Jayapal, we need them in the House fighting right now. I don't think we can afford to move them to the administration. There are other very good people who could fill those spots and who can be trusted. Doesn't have to be Jayapal. On one level, the whole exercise is a heartbreak, a tortuous glimpse of the government we could have had under a Sanders presidency. In the best case scenario, maybe two of these movement picks stand a chance of making it through the Beltway gatekeepers running the Biden-Harris transition, and even that is highly unlikely. Now, that is realistic from Klein. But that doesn't make this aggressive attempt to move the benchmarks a waste of time. The fact that Sunrise and Justice Democrats were so quick to capitalize on record youth turnout in the elections and go on the offense with their vision for a transformational administration speaks to just how different this moment is from 2008. I entirely agree with Adair. The groups that mobilized to defeat Trump have every intention of staying mobilized and pushing Biden at every stage. And the Biden people have every intention of staying mobilized and pushing them back with money, with the people they're probably going to appoint to these cabinets, with corporate propaganda. It's going to be a tough fight. We should feel encouraged because we're mobilized in a way we were not mobilized in 2009 and 2010 when we went back to sleep. And it's great to have these younger people with us now as well. Anyway, Naomi says that's a very good thing, and though it won't give us Bernie's would-be cabinet, it is already yielding some modest results. Every cabinet-level appointment will be heavily scrutinized for their industry ties, which is already happening to Biden's transition teams, and was far from the case for Obama. And though Biden will likely never use the term, quote, Green New Deal, unquote, there are clear indications that the vision of a holistic government-wide approach to the climate crisis is already shaping the outlines of the new administration. Well, she's hopeful about that. I am not quite so hopeful. I hope she's right. I would argue that the various suggestions that we all go out and engage in active listening. Oh, here. Joining people in life-saving, job-creating common cause might even be more effective, I would argue, than the various suggestions that we all go out and engage in active listening with a pissed-off Trump voter. But what are the persistent rumblings of seamless transition to a second Trump term, most recently from top trade advisor Peter Navarro? Unfortunately, we cannot pretend it's not happening. After posting about the need for Biden to be pushed by both the growing squad inside Congress and by movements on the outside, Will Dana, a former managing editor of Rolling Stone, pointed to the ongoing and escalating attempts to delegalize the election itself and responded, quote, let's focus on making sure we have a President Biden to be disappointed in, unquote. The truth, as usual, is we have to do it all. Stop the Republicans from stealing an election they lost, and stop the Democrats from blowing a mandate they won. More truth, right? And let's just go to the Daily Poster now. How Pence and GOP senators could try to steal the election. The Daily Poster, of course, is the new vehicle created by David Sirota and his collaborators, a new media effort to try to represent the social democratic wing or the democratic socialist wing of the Democratic Party, and perhaps a third party if it comes to that. How Pence and GOP senators could try to steal the election. And I'm not going to go through this whole thing because many people have posted on the possibilities, okay, of the legislatures trying to act in 4 states. Okay, so far, GOP leaders in 4 of those states. What are the 4 states? Do they mention them? I think the states are Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, okay, and maybe Georgia. They spoke to Larry Lessig, anyway, as a professor at Harvard in constitutional law. Okay, and Lessig warned he explained how Vice President Mike Pence could try to recognize slates of Republican electors sent to Congress from 5 Biden states where GOP legislators have started voicing allegations of voter fraud. In that situation, the Republican-controlled U.S. Senate would be in a position to decide on Pence's move. And if they backed him up, Lessig says they could potentially throw the presidency to Trump. So far, GOP leaders in 4 of these states are saying they will not try to replace Biden electors with Trump electors in defiance of certified election results. Lessig's group, Equal Citizens, is launching a petition on its website that calls on Republican senators to commit right now to uphold elector slates that represent the will of the popular vote in all states. What follows is an excerpt of the Daily Poster's discussion with Lessig. And I'm not going to go through all of this because I am running out of time. But this section, what does the vice president have to do with it? We have to back up to see where he enters the story. The people vote, and the votes in the states determine who the electors from each state are. And as this happened in every single election since 1876, states send one slate of electors to the Electoral College, and those electors vote for the candidate they've been sent to support. And the process for counting those votes is one that the vice president oversees. The Constitution makes him the custodian of the electoral votes, and he opens them, and Congress then counts them. So long as there's one slate from every state, there's no problem. But if he opens them and there's more than one slate from a state, then all sorts of shenanigans could unfold. Of course, those are not shenanigans. They are dirty, dirty tricks. Let's start with where the dispute could start, which is at the state legislative level. How possible is it for Republican state legislatures to choose a slate of electors different from the one chosen by voters, and do states have laws preventing this from happening? This theory, state legislatures have the power to appoint a slate of electors contradicting the results of the election, has been pushed by the right-wing radio talk show host Mark Levin. There are 2 grounds on which you might rest that theory. One is federal law, which says that if a state has decided to pick its electors through an election, and that election has failed, quote unquote, then the legislature can select the slate of electors in another way. The other ground that this theory could rest on is just the Constitution itself. And that's what Mark Levin says, that Article 2 of the Constitution gives the state legislatures the power to pick whatever state electors they want. There are problems with each of these theories. If you say that it's a failed election, you actually have to show it was a failed election. You can't just make up the idea there was fraud here. You got to establish that there was fraud. And if there was fraud that somehow undermines the election, then maybe we should be able to talk about this as being a failed election. But there's been nothing that's established that there is any kind of fraud. That means we have to look at the constitutional argument. And the constitutional argument has 3 fundamental flaws with it. The first fundamental flaw is the Constitution gives the legislatures the power to pick the electors, no doubt, but it also gives Congress the say on what day. Congress said the electors will be selected on November 3rd. November 3rd has already happened, and the only electors that can be appointed under federal law are the people who are appointed on November 3rd. There's no power for the state legislatures now to appoint a slate of electors because obviously it's after November 3rd. The second problem with it is that this power that Levin says legislatures have, the power to ignore what the people have said in an election, no legislature ever in the history of the nation has exercised it. No legislature has ever thought it had the power to veto the vote of the people and pick its own slate of electors. So this power that Mark Levin says is in our Constitution is a power that just has never been exercised by anyone. And the third problem with this claim is in relation to the Supreme Court's unanimous decision in July about the power that electors have. In that case, the question was whether electors, people who actually cast the vote, can cast their ballots however they want. What the Supreme Court said was, it may be that originally electors had this discretion, but democracy has overtaken the framers' design. It's amazing, but this court, this very conservative court, has said that. What about the idea the Republicans can manufacture a political context and environment outside of the scope of the current law that then creates the conditions for the state legislatures to change their state laws? Is that possible? And Larry Lessig says, you're right to worry about what the political environment empowers these legislatures to do. They're not empowered by the law. I think the law is clear. But in this political context, if they can raise enough anxiety or panic about these elections, let's imagine that these 5 Biden states with Republican state legislatures do appoint another slate of electors. And let's imagine the slates of electors cast their ballots on December 14th, and they send their certified results to Mike Pence, and Pence opens them on January 6th and begins to process them. The Arizona slate gets opened up, and there's one slate that purports to be for Joe Biden, and another slate that purports to be for Donald Trump. Now, this turns out to be really important. Arizona has a Republican governor. So imagine the Republican governor signs the slate for Trump. Under the rules for counting electoral votes, the vice president could say, I've got 2 slates here. I'm going to recognize the slate signed by the Republican governor. There would be an objection. And if there's an objection that's signed by both the senator and a member of the House of Representatives, then the 2 bodies would separate. The senators would walk back over into the Senate, and they would decide whether they're going to uphold the objection or reject it. Now, we can imagine that the Democratic House will vote to uphold the objection. They'll say that Biden's slate should be counted. Then the question is whether the Republican Senate votes to reject the objection. So let's start with the most partisan assumption. Let's assume. Oh, sorry, folks. My bad. So let's start with the most partisan assumption. Let's assume all the Republicans hang together. That means the houses have disagreed about which slate should be counted. And if the houses disagree about which slate should be counted, under the rules of counting the slate of electors, it's the slate of electors signed by the governor that gets counted. So that means it would be the Republican slate that gets counted. But here's why that would be a very stupid move for the Republicans to make, because of the 5 states this game could be played in, 3 states have Democratic governors, and only 2 states have Republican governors, Arizona and Georgia. So that means if they counted the slates the governors of count have assigned, Joe Biden would still have enough votes in the Electoral College because he would have Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. That would put him over 270. So that's not what they would do if they were going to play this game. Instead, what they would do if they're going to play this game is that the houses would separate. The Republican Senate would vote to affirm the Republican slate of electors. The Democratic House would vote to affirm the Democratic slate of electors. That means that both houses have not voted to reject the move by the vice president to count the Republican slates. And if they don't reject the move by the vice president to count the Republican slate gets counted. And so what that means is if the houses disagree, Mike Pence's ruling stand, and Mike Pence's ruling would be on the assumption we're making would be for the Republican slate in all 5 of those cases, and he would therefore count Donald Trump and himself into the presidency. If voters want to call their elected officials to ensure that the popular vote in their state is respected, which politicians should they be pressuring? We are launching a petition on our website at equalcitizens.us that calls on Republican senators to affirm that they're not going to vote against the vote of the people in any of these states. What is the actual vote you're asking those senators to commit to casting? So again, the scenario we're imagining is Arizona comes up, there's a Republican slate signed by the governor, a Democratic slate that is in accord with the certification of the Secretary of State in Arizona. And Mike Pence says, I believe the Constitution gives the Republican legislature the power to appoint their electors however they want, because I've read the words of the great constitutional scholar Mark Levin, and that's what he has said. Immediately, there's an objection filed to the ruling of the chair, and each body has to decide how it's going to vote on the objection. And what the objection is saying is, no, you can't recognize the Republican slate. You have to recognize the Democratic slate. And the Democratic House will vote to say, we agree with the objection, and the Republican Senate will have to vote to decide whether it's going to agree with the objection. So 5 Republican senators would have to vote with the Democrats in the Senate to say that they believe that the objection should be sustained. Who exactly sends each slate to Mike Pence in the Arizona example? The legislature is not involved. The governor is not involved. Secretary of State is not involved. Secretary of State and governor and legislature are involved for the purpose of selecting who the electors are. In Arizona, there will be 11 people who believe that because of the election results as certified by the Secretary of State, they are the electors for the state of Arizona. They will then gather in a room, and they will cast their ballots according to the 12th Amendment. They will sign them and certify them in the way the 12th Amendment says. They will send them to Mike Pence, and Mike Pence will receive them. And Mike Pence on January 6th will open up the ballots from Arizona. Under the scenario we're talking about, there'll be one slate who purports to be voting for Joe Biden and another slate that purports to be voting for Donald Trump. So in this example of 2 slates being from one state, the vice president is the initial judge of which the slate of electors is valid, and Congress is the ultimate arbiter. I don't think there's any question as a matter of law about the power the vice president has. I don't think the vice president has any legal power to judge which slate of electors ought to be counted. But as a matter of practical political power, the vice president is also the presiding officer over the joint session of Congress that is counting the electoral votes. And as the presiding officer, he gets to say what he wants. So when he opens the certificate as the presiding officer, he can say as presiding officer, I deem the Republican slate from Arizona to be the slate that will be counted. When he says that, it's open for Congress to overturn the presiding officer's ruling. That's what happens with any presiding officer, but the only way they get to overturn it is if both houses agree that it ought to be overturned. So that's where the source of this really dangerous power in the vice president lies. What are the odds that all of this actually happens? I'm quite certain that if 10 Republican senators said tomorrow, hell no, I'm never going to vote against the vote. I'm never going to vote against legitimate vote of the people in any state. It would all fizzle out tomorrow. But if the Republican senators continue to play along with the president's suggestion that there's a reason to question these results, and the political movement, which is being fueled by right-wing media right now to get people to demand that those Republican state legislatures, quote, do their duty, unquote, as Mark Levin has put it. I'm scared because if they do their duty as Mark Levin conceives of it and creates an alternative slate of electors, that begins to trigger in people's minds the possibility, and that possibility is certainly there that Mike Pence plays this game in the way I've described it. Then at that stage, it really depends on the senators standing up in the face of a real possibility of electing Donald Trump. Isn't there also a question of whether Mike Pence plays along? Right, there are many, many profiles in courage here, and this is not actually the original profile in courage, because from my perspective, at least what they would be doing is doing the right thing against great pressure from the other side. But regardless, the many profiles in courage are at least 5 Republican senators saying, we believe in democracy over Donald Trump, and the mini profile in courage would be Mike Pence saying, I'm not going to sacrifice democracy for Donald Trump and Mike Pence. What terrifies me about it is it's clear that somebody is thinking about the violence that follows. We have a fired defense secretary and a replacement of pretty senior people in the Defense Department. What is that for? Why would you even waste your time as the vice president right now firing your defense secretary? From the standpoint of they will do whatever it takes to win, I'm telling you that's the path they would have to follow in order to win. So that is what Larry Lessig had to say about that. It is a frightening possibility. We have to pressure Republican senators in Republican states to declare that in this kind of scenario, they will not vote against the votes of the people of their state for the presidency. They will not vote against that, whatever Mike Pence does. That is the best guarantee that Pence would not be able to steal the election for Trump. We have to pressure them. We have to get those 5 senators. Probably it won't be that hard to get Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, and Mitt Romney to do that, because they don't really want any more of Trump as the president of the United States. They are corporate people. You know that. But you also know the corporate people, more and more of them, are in Biden's corner for this particular election. And Donald Trump is a constant embarrassment to them. And he's going to be an embarrassment to Lisa Murkowski when she has to run again in just a few years for the Senate, if she wants to stand again, which she may want to do. And Mitt Romney likes occasionally to stand up to Trump. And I know he can't stand Trump, and that he would like to get Trump out of the presidency, even at the cost of having Joe Biden in the presidency. Besides, he probably thinks he can beat Joe Biden. So you might get those 3 votes, but the question is, can you get the other 2 votes that you would need to make this happen? Who would likely turn against Donald Trump? We don't know. There's one more thing I wanted to go over. I don't have the time to go over it because it's time for your comments, but I do want to call your attention to it. It's an article by Ryan Cooper, which appeared in The Week. I've linked to it. It's called Trump's Willing Accomplices, and it goes over the same tack that we've just been through. The basic point here is that these people have to quit being Trump accomplices at this point. Now, we do have more of them expressing opinions that Biden was the winner. But of course, there's pressure from the other side to back a movement that says that Biden was not actually the winner, of the election. There are still claims of fraud in the process, not of individual voter fraud, but of systemic fraud in terms of rigging the machines in certain states. Now, I personally believe there may well have been rigging of the machines, but I don't know if there's any reason to believe that there was rigging of the machines in just the key states that went for the Democrats. There may have been rigging of the machines in Texas. There's great suspicion there was rigging of the machines in California, in some parts of California. Now, Trump won, of course, Biden won, in California. So if there were rigging of the machines there, it's probably rigging against the progressives who ran in California. I can easily believe that. But if there's evidence of rigging, in other words, there wasn't just an election of Trump versus Biden. Why would the machine rigging just stop with Trump, as opposed to Biden? Well, evidently, if it did take place in California, it was about rigging the vote against progressive candidates trying to overturn Democrats in Dem races that occurred in California. So the rigging was more widespread than simply the presidential election. But who's to say there wasn't rigging in Texas? There might well have been rigging of Texas, not just against Biden, but against Democratic congressional candidates in close races in Texas. There were plenty of fairly close races in Texas where Democratic candidates who were progressive were turned aside. There may have been rigging in those races. There may have been that kind of rigging all over the country. I'm not about to exclude the possibility. But I don't know how to discover that systematically in all the states where it may have happened. In a time period where the country can be left hanging in the middle of COVID, okay, and in the middle of a depression being caused by COVID and by the unwillingness of Congress to act. And I don't know what the consequence is if you recognize that not only the presidential race could have been rigged in this way, but also congressional races could have been rigged in this way, so that there's no guarantee that the new Congress that is slated to take over in January is really a legitimate Congress. So, I certainly think of the possibility of having machine rigging in these past elections. But I'm not sure what can be done about it at this particular point without turning the whole country upside down. I think, therefore, the best thing to do is to look at the results as they are. In some ways, they're bad results for both sides. Go ahead with these results and work like the damnedest to take us back to paper ballots counted by hand in all the areas of the United States. That's the only way to fix the problem for the future. I don't know if there's any fixing of the problem during the next 2 months or during the next month. We really have about a month to fix the problem. Anyway, so Ryan Cooper goes on and talks about the possibilities for sabotaging the process, okay, of the Electoral College, okay, and the electors and getting them to support Trump. He talks about the possibility, okay, of Calvin Ball arguments. And he talks about how Reconstruction governments were toppled in the House and replaced by one-party Jim Crow apartheid state. He talks about that. It's quite, okay, an interesting article. And then he says, okay, again, at this point, it seems rather implausible to think that Trump will succeed in overturning the election results. Though given the circumstances, I wouldn't hazard a hazard a prediction that's firm either. But Trump has established a clear formula for a Republican Party that has become unashamedly authoritarian to follow, one that resonates disturbingly with some of the darkest periods of American history, and as most of a century of Jim Crow tyranny shows, it only takes one success for an authoritarian movement to entrench itself in power indefinitely. Then he says something that I believe in completely. The Republican Party is a threat to the Constitution and the political liberty, of all Americans. And I'd add to that, and I'd say, certainly the Democratic Party is certainly corrupt and is full of all kinds of problems, and in some ways is a threat to the Constitution as well. But it's the Republican Party that represents the most systematic threat and the least degree of support for the Constitution. I think that party has to be destroyed. And then we go to work on destroying the Democrats too, or forcing them to go back to democracy. And when I say that, I'm not even sure they had any faith in democracy at all, ever. But we forced them to democracy at that point. But we need to kill the Republican Party. We need to make it die. We need to have a third party that is for the people. And then we have to get a party on the other side, or more parties on the other side, that themselves are representative of the people and not representative of the elites. We have to get the country turned over to people's parties again. So there. That was all my bad. I will now take your comments. I'm looking at 10:53, so notice I have gone live again at 10:53. I don't think my stream actually ended, though there was probably a break in it. So I'm going back to the beginning again to get your comments in. So far I have the beginning. I'm afraid I don't have the beginning. StreamYard is only giving me comments since 10:20. So I will read those, then I will try to get some other comments from Facebook itself. Evelina says, I hold so few expectations of Biden, really. I think he'll be even less effective than Obama. He doesn't even have a second term to worry about. Okay, Evelina, I agree. I don't think we should have any expectations, of Biden. But this isn't about expectations. It's about pressure. It's about us fighting. It's about us pouring the pressure onto Biden and seeing what happens. That's what it's about. We need to forget expectations. We need to forget hopes. Why? Because we're all in a fight for our lives. We're out of time. We have to have something concrete, really good happen with respect to managing the climate crisis. That is the existential threat. We have to fight for our lives. So screw expectations of Biden. Screw hopes for Biden. Screw hopes for his administration. Let's have expectations of ourselves. Let's have hopes for ourselves, what we can do. Let's not worry about Biden and what he thinks. Let's just get so much pressure on him that he cannot say no. Kay says, I hear the guy he hired to lead the climate office is a fossil fuel receiver. He needs scientists in that office. I think the guy, I'm not sure what you mean by the climate office. For the Department of Energy, he appointed someone by the name of Monitz, who was the Secretary of Energy for a time in the Obama administration. He is, I believe, a scientist. Okay. He's not a climate scientist, though. I think he's a nuclear energy scientist. He's not, a climate scientist. I don't think he hired anybody to lead the climate office, as yet. I don't think there's a climate office as yet, as far as I know, unless he announced something and I haven't seen it. Steve says, Trump praises Michigan Republicans for blocking Detroit certification moments after they backed down and certified. Alva says, Biden isn't taking this seriously enough. Rick Mendes says, Ro Khanna to replace Harris in the Senate. Oh, that's interesting. So there's an article, in Medium that says, but Ro Khanna will replace Harris. I think that's good for Ro. It might be good for the Senate, in the long term. It's not help to us in the immediate future in relation to the House. We need a block in the House to be able to block out Nancy Pelosi, stop her from becoming the speaker again. And we need Ro Khanna to be part of that block. If Newsom appoints a congressperson to replace Ro Khanna in the Congress, he will appoint a Pelosi crony. That's what he will do. And the Pelosi crony will follow Pelosi like a little puppy dog. Evelina says, Avril Mono, he isn't. Steve Wolfbrand says, Pelosi could have gotten us some COVID relief. Trump offered another $1,200 check. She just wanted to make Trump look bad. Thanks for nothing, Nancy. Steve, look, I agree that she pulled that bonehead play. She pulled another bonehead play, much more serious, with regard to the CARES Act. She should have forced them to take care of everybody with a money cannon as big as the one that she authorized for the big businesses. She didn't do that. She folded on the CARES Act. She didn't consult with anybody else. Her staff was too stupid to see what they were doing for the big businesses and that it would destroy her leverage. She just screwed that up. At the beginning, she screwed it up. Then she screwed it up all the rest of the way, too. I mean, I'll agree, she screwed it up. Lots of people screwed this up. Chuck Schumer in the Senate screwed it up. He should have done everything he could to block Amy Coney Barrett. And he should have kept reminding Trump, the more time we waste on Amy Coney Barrett, the more time we're not going to have for a stimulus bill that can maybe get you reelected, Donald. Nobody ever made that clear to Trump. I'm sure if somebody had, that Trump would have said, confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett can wait till after the election. Let's get a stimulus bill out. Evelina says, Ro Khanna in the pics. Avril said, Evelina Pont, Biden better start cussing and fussing like his panties are in a bunch. Evelina says, Avril Mono, don't think he cares enough. Look, he has children. He has grandchildren. I mean, he doesn't want him to die. Avril says, Evelina Ponti's going to fuck around and find out about how serious COVID DT is. Evelyn says, doesn't care that much that his pants are in a bunch. Rick says, Jim Acosta, at Acosta, 2 hours, stewing in the White House. The lame duck president just fired a leading cybersecurity official in Chris Krebs, who vouched for the security of the U.S. election. Trump still has more than 2 months before he has to go. 2 more months to settle scores and potentially cause great damage. Yep, I know. Steve Wolfbrandt says, what a silly election system. It is a silly election system. And, I mean, dragging out the period between the time when the new president takes office, okay, and the day of the election is really, really stupid. We got to have it won by the popular vote. We would know the winner of the popular vote probably within a week. Even when certain things hang over, we would know that. When the popular vote, okay, is certified, then the new president should take office right then and there. No transition. Have the transition when the new president actually takes over. Pay 2 sets of people for a transitional period of 2 months. Continue to pay the Trump people and to require them to come to work for the transition period. That's what the transition should be like. But control of the government should be taken over by the new president very shortly after the election. The same way it's done in a parliamentary system. Weeks after, not months after. We got to modernize this system. Evelina says this is going to get stretched and dragged out and dragged on. Maybe. Kay says we have the most unfair election system there is. No. There are still nations in which the election system is totally rigged for a dictator and where a dictator cannot be put out. And that's it. So that's even more of an unfair election system than we have. Avril says, Pence is dangerously loyal to Adolf. Frightening. Kay says, we need popular vote or at least RCV, ranked choice voting. And Avril says, DeSantis, Paper ballots, I said that already. Avril says, but Death DeSantis isn't going to go for the people's vote. He'll help Pence. Yeah, but he's not a senator, so that's not relevant. I mean, he's in Florida, and Trump won Florida, so he's going to authorize the slate of electors who voted for Trump. So he's not at issue here. He's not relevant. Avril says, man, Trump better call Corn Pop to help him against the tangerine tyrant. Kay says, rigging of the machines usually is done to support the GOP. No. I mean, rigging of the machines is done to support establishment Dems. Too. It's not only the Republicans who rig. I'm sure if Democrats control the machinery in certain key states, that they control all the machinery, that they're not above rigging in the general. If they were willing to rig in the primary against Bernie, you know they rigged in the primary. Why wouldn't they rig in the general? I know a reason. One reason is, if they rig in the primary, they could always go to court and say, hey, we're a corporation. It's our right to choose whichever candidate we want in the way we want, even if it involves rigging a primary election. They could say that. But if it's not a party election, if the general public is involved, everybody is involved, I think there are probably laws, against actually rigging elections, and they may have some criminal penalties. But it's probably going to depend on each state. I don't think there's a national law about that. Rick says, secular talk at Kyle Kulinski, 3 hours. Our wars in the Middle East cost $7 trillion, and you're being told they have to continue while our infrastructure gets a grade of D+. 30 million Americans have no health insurance. It's more than 30 million Americans, Rick. It's 38 to 40 million Americans now. I'm telling you, it's at least that high because there are more Americans now, okay, than there used to be. And 1 out of every 781 Americans who don't have insurance, okay, die annually. So roughly 37, I would say, probably with Trump's tightening up and the monkeying around with the Affordable Care Act, I'll bet there are 37 million Americans who have no health insurance right now. Oh, and also with COVID, a lot of people have lost coverage on insurance due to COVID. There may be another 10 million there. We might be talking about 47 million Americans right now who have no health insurance. And 30% of the country is on the brink of being foreclosed or evicted. And Avril says, an HRC in 16 against Bernie, okay, says it's called the red shift when it's done to help the GOP. My Scott and I saw it happen in North Carolina years ago. If you vote by machine, recheck it several times. It probably happened this year. There wasn't there a red shift in favor of Trump in North Carolina this year? Kay says, I prefer vote by mail. Well, during COVID, everybody prefers to vote by mail or to early vote, okay, at least.
You did drive up.
Yeah, we did a drive up. That was very convenient here. Ava said, we need to stab the Republican Party with the steely knives Grandma saw. Kay says, but Michael E. Mann needs to be in the climate change office. He's a climate scientist. I know. And he would be very good in the climate change office. He would be really excellent. It seems to me the progressives would love to have him as the head, though the Sunrise Movement, I believe, has named somebody else, but I have to double check that. I think they named a good person as well. And then there's Bill McKibben as well. Steve says 24,000 GOP, actually 24,000 Gophers with GOP capitalized in Gophers, voted absentee in the primary, did not vote in the general. MAGA math, showing Donald Trump cost himself the election by sowing distrust in absentee voting. He would have won by 10,000 votes. He actually depressed his own voting base. In which state was that? In which state was that, Steve Gonzo? Avril says, no, Biden better call Corn Pop. Did I say Trump originally? Sorry, that was wrong. We understood it to be Biden who had to call Corn Pop. Barbara Wernick says, fact, they can win in the primary. It should all be considered, primary in general. If primary is rigged, don't ever trust the general. I agree. I don't trust the general. I don't trust it anyway. Because since no one has gone to jail for that, there are probably people who do it in the general who think they can get away with it. And maybe they can. We don't know since no one seems to have tried. And Steve Gonzo says, Georgia. Oh, you mean in Georgia, he might have screwed himself. I hope so. Steve says, good night all. Good night, Steve. I'm going to check on whether there were some early ones from before that I can. Oh, gee. Thank you for all the hearts. I looked at that. And there were all kinds of hearts. Maybe that was just for Steve, though. For Steve saying good night. I'm scrolling down to try to get some early comments, folks. Facebook's been playing tricks on me lately. I think I've got some early comments. Steve Wolfbrandt, who's replying to Avril, says, badminton is fun. Avril says, Tin Pot Coup, I think we should protest it beating our time and other metal pots. Kay says, I used to play badminton when I was a kid. And uh, and replying to Avril Mono, Steve says, Avril Mono, oh, okay, Avril says, Steve Wolfbrand, I love it. And Avril says, I even bought her a little tennis scout set to wear because she loves dressing up in different outfits. And then Avril Mono says, escort outfit, damn autocorrect. Steve says, off topic, just watched a free movie on YouTube. It's called The Celestine Prophecies. Very nice movie. They have some pretty good free movies. Yeah, we watched The Girl with the Pearl Earring, which is a movie about Vermeer, Johannes Vermeer, and the painting he created, but it's really a movie about a Dutch culture, okay, at that time, and the domination of an elite over everybody else, the business elite, okay, over everybody else. Excellent movie, excellent cast. Colin Firth is Vermeer, and Scarlett Johansson is the girl with the pearl earring. Avril Mono says, I read the book. Kay says, we also had a shuffleboard painted in our driveway where I grew up. Laugh out loud. Yeah, shuffleboard is fun. Avril says, I think those Philadelphia nurses are really going on general strike soon. Fingers crossed. If they go on general strike, what are people going to do? Rick says, evening all. Avril says, yeah, Biden better wake up and smell the fascist coffee. Kay says, I was best at roller skating on the blacktop driveway, and yes, the skates had a key back then. Yeah, I was good at roller skating too. We had a sidewalk outside of our very big apartment house in the Bronx, and we all were pretty good at roller skating back then. It was a favorite thing. And yes, there were skate keys. We had skate keys in order to adjust the skates. Kay says, was always very good, also very good at target shooting with my little Craftsman 22 rifle in the backyard back then. Laugh out loud, those were the days. Steve said, well, if you need a laugh, the old comedy, It's a Mad, Mad World, is also available free on YouTube, funny AF. And Steve says, the Dreamers need a break. Alvaro says, great articles, Dr. Joe, great writers. Yeah, they were great articles, and they said things very well. And I hope my commentary was the equal of the articles. And Steve says, the task forces were complete bullshit. Well, we thought so at the time, Steve, that they were complete bullshit. I don't know anybody who put any faith in them. Even when he said, I hold so few expectations of Biden, really, I think he'll be less effective than Obama. That's where I came in. Okay, that's where I picked things up. So I think I've done about as much as I can do tonight in terms of comments. I have the link here so I can get to the Senator Ro Khanna story. But Steve said, sweet dreams. That was nice. And I'm going to say good night and sweet dreams to everyone as well, because I think it's time to say good night. Thank you very much for coming. And Barbara says Biden will do nothing. It's not a question of what Biden will do. It's a question of what we can make him do. We got to fight, Barbara. We got to fight. Barbara says, your commentary on the articles was the cream of the crop. Thank you, Carmen. Thank you. And good night, all. I'll see you tomorrow, Wednesday at 9. Thank you, everybody. Okay. I love you all. Good night.